And today we have Ruth Nolan. And Ruth and Mike, raise your hand, Mike. Mike came with her, he's assistant. So we appreciate them coming today. And Ruth is going to be telling us about Willie Boy. I've had all kinds of funny looks on you people when I say Willie Boy because, you know, you might not have seen the movie, might not have heard the story, so it's really interesting. And so let's give Ruth a big hand. Okay.
Hello everybody. It's really exciting to be here because I actually grew up in Apple Valley and spent a lot of time over the years in Wrightwood. I've hiked all the mountains. I worked at Mountain High for a season. Brought my daughter up here when she was a baby. We hiked all those peaks that you probably don't want to hike anymore. Get tired. Right. Do that when you're younger. So I'm really excited to be here and to share this ongoing research that I've been doing into the ever enticing story of Willie. So I'm going to call him Willie because some of the leading American Indian scholars and artists and tribal members are wanting to kind of change the perception of even how Willie is named, and the idea that Louis DeSoto, an artist who did a Willie Boy installation up at the 29 Palms Visitor Center for Joshua Tree National Park. If you have a chance to get over there and look at it, he rendered this story as through the eyes of Carlota, who is one of the players in the story. And he said, if Willie was here today, we want to call a grown man Willie Boy. Or is that a little bit condescending? And maybe a little bit racist. So excitingly to me as a scholar, and someone who's just interested in the story, as so many of you have already shared with me, is that this is a living story, and it's continuing to evolve and have different interpretations. And I'll talk today about why this story is so enticing to us, why it parlays as great literature right up there with Shakespeare, because it has a lot of the elements of literature that make a good story. And this is a true story, but the facts are very shape-shifty and continue to evolve over time. So a little bit about my background on the topic. Since I did grow up in the desert, and as I got older, grew into adulthood, went to college, desert scholarship through literature, the desert, kind of became one of my big things. So I actually had put together a book for Heyday Books in Berkeley in 2009 called No Place for a Puritan, the Literature of California's Deserts. And I wanted this to be a comprehensive reader, focusing on the entire California desert region, which is huge, beginning with Native American stories and culture, coming all the way through westward settlement to the modern day, and including representations from writers that would surprise you. Like, who knew that John Steinbeck, the great American writer, actually wrote some of his best excerpts in his novels about the Mojave Desert? Does anybody know that? You did? In The Grapes of Wrath, and also in Travel with Charlie. So I do have copies of that book for sale. So in my research, in my research for that book, which I did as a sabbatical project for my teaching job at College of the Desert, down in Palm Desert, I had gotten very into the Willie story, primarily by beginning the reading of Willie Boy, the novel. And how many of you have read that? Or seen the movie?
Seen the movie.
Okay, so 1960 historian Harry Lawton, who taught at UC Riverside, actually wrote the book Willie Boy, which called Willie Boy, the Last Manhunt, where he patterned it as a Western novel. So it reads like a Western novel. And then I started digging in and saying, this is a really interesting story, and just on my own began to amass a body of research. What has been written and told and shared through literature, poetry, essays, news articles, documentaries, plays, films, and so forth, and even in art in the last 100+ years since the incident took place in 1909. So I'm going to pass this around as I give my talk to let you look at some of the materials that I found. This is by no means comprehensive. So I'll start it here. You can look at this while I talk. So welcome to the stories of Willie Boy. I need to change that. Sorry for the formatting. I forgot to bring my laptop, and we had to use this one. So I just have some slides that go along to talk about who are some of the players. As I begin, I also had put together a book of poems that was published in 2016 called Ruby Mountain, and I took inspiration from the story of Willie and Carlota as the basis for my story. And I want to read a quick poem that to me embodies the spirit of Willie as both a real person and a legend, a legendary figure. Last manhunt. He is one of us, living on both sides of the fence, living on his second breath, singing Wovoka's ghost dance, singing of palm tree revivals, singing of lizards sipping at faint oases, of a midday sun tearing flesh from breasts, of an early morning hangman's noose, visions of an in-between world, running through Joshua Tree Forest, running past the shotgun marks on rocks, running beyond where night finds day, wearing his ghost shirt, immune to bullets, immune to railroads, immune to the absence of rain, immune to gold, the yellow metal that makes white men crazy. And when we come to remember him, to remember his shadow, the footprints he left behind, where it's rumor that he found his death or may have gotten away, his memory will speak to us, and we will remember that he will have remembered. I have inhabited this town. I have passed you by. I am blind. I have remembered, and I will show you again, but this is how the arrow flies. So the big question, the driving question in this 2-week saga between a young man named Willie, who was of Southern Paiute descent, and who lived and worked, apparently, and to do some research, he wasn't just in the 29 Palms area. He had for a time worked at the Kemper Campbell Ranch in Victorville. Do any of you know where that is? I actually used to live there for some years. It's a great place. And I'm like, this is really exciting. I mean, Willie Boy lived here and worked for this ranch. So he was in that era, the early 1900s, working as a ranch hand and seasonal worker, which would have been very common for Native American people in the area, in that era. And so over the 2-week saga, when a young man named Willie shot and killed Mike Boniface, a respected 29 Palms Paiute Indian leader and elder, over a dispute related to this young woman, Carlota Mike, who happened to be old Mike's daughter. The topic was they were in love and wanted to run away and get married, and because of tribal laws and traditions, very strict laws regarding intermarriages, you had to be so many removes from your relatives. So you couldn't marry a cousin unless they were X number. And unfortunately, Willie and Carlota were star-crossed. They were too closely related, and they were rebelling against their elders. So the story of Willie and Carlota getting embroiled in a murder, the murder of Carlota's father, and then embarking on a 2-week flight from the sheriff's posse and other lawmen that were gathered to hunt and track Willie down. Carlota ends up being shot and killed on the way. The trackers follow Willie. They cannot catch him. He keeps eluding them all the way out across the Mojave Desert, eventually ending up in a standoff with the sheriff's posse at a place called Ruby Mountain. So that was the title I used for my poetry book. Have any of you been to Ruby Mountain, or you've heard about it? You know where it is. I do know that an historical marker was put there some years ago, and it's one of those things you can't drive to it. It's rugged. It's just west of Landers. But if you're interested in visiting historical sites, that is it. I believe you can get in there by 4-wheel drive and you have to hike a little ways.
So
And I'm not sure.
Lucerne Valley?
Yeah, no.
No?
It would be between, off of Old Woman Springs Road, between Yucca Valley and Lucerne, but closer to Landers, so just west of there. And the story, according to the posse members, some of whom were wounded by Willie, who was barricading himself in the rocks, was that he was committed suicide. So the posse was outshot by Willie. They limped back to San Bernardino to get refreshed. One part of the story that wasn't publicized at the time is that Clara True, the Indian agent in Banning, actually had to go rescue them. So a woman, that was really humiliating probably for the posse members in that 1909. And by the time they got back out there, the renewed posse said, we found him, he killed himself with his shotgun. And we burned the body on the site, and that's all there is to it. But the story lives on because there are many rumors that he got away. got away and went off to live up in the Pahrump area. So this is one of those stories that does not have a clear resolution, and it continues to emerge and grow and change. And as I'm going to talk about, as I look at some of the different literatures written about this story and films and art, the Native American people who are closely related to Willie have started to have more and more of a voice in adding their version of events. So we have Willie, we have Carlota. Willie is 28 years old, Carlota is 15 or 16. Carlota has been sent to boarding schools, which in that era, the Sherman Institute, where a lot of Native American young people were being sent to leave the old ways behind and become adapted to Anglo living. So she really represents a young Native American of that era who was really between two worlds, the ancient, traditional, and are we going to adapt and fit into the new way of life. Willie was considered a little more of a rebel because he was sort of fitting in, but he was also known to be a spirit runner and was a follower of Wovoka of the ghost dance. How many of you know about the ghost dance?
What is your source on that?
Of what?
The Wovoka connection.
Well, I
He
will get to
ghost
that.
dance, really?
Yeah, he's
Okay.
reputed that he was a follower of Wovoka. Wovoka, starting in the late 1800s, was a visionary Northern Paiute who, when Native American people in that era were facing decimation and just really big challenges all over the country, it was like a visionary, I have a vision, and if we do this dance, we shall survive. And it was a movement, sort of like a revivalist movement. And it swept the country, and especially played a big role in the assassination of Sitting Bull for the Standing Rock Sioux. But it was also practiced and followed. So it would be maybe typified as a visionary, if we just pray like this, our world as we know it isn't going to end. So to be associated with the ghost dance in that era was considered an act of defiance to the US government. And you probably would not want to be openly doing it. So Willie was a little bit of a rebel. He heard a rebel yell and he wasn't quite conforming. So let me just read a little bit. At its heart, the story of Willie Boy is a timeless and living story. One that's colored and flavored as exquisitely and sometimes as violently as the desert and inland Southern California landscape, across which it occurred starting in late September 1909. This is a story that crossed the divide geographically between city and desert, between the Anglo world of the 20th century, the early 20th century, and the ancient storied landscape of the Native American world. It crossed the divide into the narrow and elusive realm of young forbidden love, one that crosses and continues to cross a slippery slope of truth and fact. So this is a story that has Shakespearean elements. How many of you are familiar with Romeo and Juliet? Very famous, enduring story, great literature. At the heart of this is the star-crossed lovers who can't be together and they end up, both of them have tragic ends. So likewise, Willie and Carlota was a very similar type of a story. This is also a story that reveals tragically some of the darkest truths and sad realities of life for many mission and Native American people of the era, where the mission system and the gold rush really had inflicted some heavy-duty scars on people in this region, sadly and tragically, and certainly it's arguable that Willie and Carlota were in part a victim of that as well. This is a story that refuses to die, and most recently has been renewed and revitalized with the recent publication of the amazing book by Native scholar and distinguished UC art history professor and one of my friends and associates, Dr. Clifford Trausser, in his book, Chemehuevi Song, The Resilience of a Southern Paiute Tribe. So he went out and actually met, over the last 10 years, Native American people, descendants of Willie, people who have heard stories passed down, and in his book, he brought in a lot more information from their point of view. So Clifford and I are loosely writing a book together. He invited me to do a book with him that he's going to talk about, use some of his interviews with family members of Willie and Carlota, the descendants of whom are now the Cabazon Band of 29 Mission Indians who run the Spotlight 29 Casino down in the Coachella Valley. And also people that I've been working closely with. They're establishing a Native American community college in the region, and I'm one of the founding members. So it's very interesting that I've gotten to know some of the descendants of Willie's family. And so Clifford and Clifford's going to give some background information of the story of Willie, and my contribution is to talk about all the different things that have been written and presented about the story. And we'll have lots of photographs, so hopefully we'll get that done before too long. So what's the quick 5 W's of the Willie story? The literary schema, the murder, the flight, and the capture. So our timeline is starting in the evening of September 26, 1909, starting at the Gilman Ranch in Banning, which is another historical site some of you may know about. Has anybody been to that? It's a wonderful place to go. They do tours, you can go visit it. An historic old ranch that's been designated as an historic site for Riverside County. I think it's Riverside County, yeah, right near San Bernardino. Starting at the Gilman Ranch in Banning and lasting approximately 12 days, ending at Ruby Mountain, adjacent to the Mojave Desert. So it covered some of our local geographies of the region. And as we can see, and I'm sorry these are a little bit small because I forgot my computer, but as Willie had gone and committed the murder, and this became a really big national story, some have likened it to the O.J. Simpson story of its time. We all remember that got a lot of news coverage. What's another big story of its type that's riveted the nation? Can someone think of one since O.J. Simpson?
Oh, I was going back earlier to kidnapping.
The baby, the kid, yeah. I didn't know that one because I wasn't alive, but it gained national attention, and I'll talk about how that happened. But this was the evening news, the big story of its time.
Portrayed as an Indian uprising.
Yeah, which got colored in a very dark way that was, so immediately the signs went out, wanted for murder. So this was one of the signs, and if you can look in the book there, I have a copy of it where you can actually see what it says. So Willie Boy, Chimmawawa Indian, they misspelled the word. 20 years old, yada yada. He's wanted for the murder of old Mike. He has a .30-30 rifle with him, and there's a $50 reward for getting him. If you bring him in, dead or alive. This is dated October 1st, 1909. So almost, what would that be? 108 years, 109 years to the day. This was happening in this region. The primary characters, once again, are Willie Boy, Willie, the 28-year-old, Carlota, his forbidden 16-year-old lover, Mike Boniface, Carlota's father, respected elder and tribal leader, various members of the San Bernardino Sheriff's Posse, which included Native American trackers from the region. And once again, Willie and Carlota are distant cousins, and they met at the 29 Palms Oasis, which tribally is known as the Oasis of Mara, and was a village site for many centuries for one band of Native American, the Southern Paiute tribe, but also shared and used as a resource site for different tribes that were passing through, such as Serrano and even Kalia. So what happened? In a nutshell, once again, they were in love. Due to tribal incest laws, they could not get married. They ran away once. The family went and got them, tried to keep them apart, but the two of them were very defiant. And that could have been fueled possibly by the ghost dance on Willie's part, and for Carlota, maybe she was just a rebellious teenager. This happened, right? Teenagers rebel. And especially in that era, when the world was changing so fast, there may have been a lot of stuff giving her incentive not to just be the traditional young Indian girl. Because she was having one foot in the changing Anglo world by going to the boarding school. Okay, so Mike Boniface was shot and killed at Gilman Ranch. We don't know what happened. Did Willie just walk up and shoot him in cold blood? Was there a tussle over the gun? Was maybe Mike the one with the gun and Willie got it away? So those details remain nebulous. We never got Willie to say what happened. And Carlota was shot during the I don't even want to call it a manhunt, but during their run from the law, she was shot and killed. So we don't have any witnesses. And it's arguable, possibly, Mike Boniface's wife and maybe some of her siblings may have seen what happened, but given the era, they were terrified to even report what happened because they didn't want to cause any trouble for themselves. In an era of much Indian hating and discrimination. So Mike Boniface's wife didn't even report it till the next day, because apparently she was really scared to speak up about it. The story just happened to be picked up as the sheriff's posse was organizing their party. Got picked up by the New York Times. Now, how did that happen? Of all things. Remember, there's no internet, there's no TV, but New York Times and other national reporters just happened to be in Riverside because there was a presidential visit at the time, which the chair for the president at the time is still at the Mission Inn in Riverside. Has anybody seen that big chair? I think it was William Taft. I'm a little tired today because I'm teaching. So, and the elevation too, I have to use the elevation here, which is great, but I'm like, So there was a presidential visit in Riverside. And
You need
so,
some water, Ruth?
No, I have some, thanks. Presidential visit to downtown Riverside. And all these reporters caught wind of, oh my God, there's an Indian guy, a murderer on the loose. So instantly the whole story just took off. And as you see from some of the examples of news stories from the era that were published in the New York Times, they really help fuel the fire because they instantly label it, this is a manhunt, there's a vicious murdering Indian on the loose, which instantly, of course, terrified everybody in the region. People don't know what's going on. And feeding to this idea where there were a lot of misunderstanding between Anglo and Indian people, it was very easy to fuel those fires of fear. So the posse was assigned to hunt Willie down, but there was a little problem. So as you can see from my map, and it's a little small, but the map is also in the book I'm passing around. The shooting took place here, the murder. Willie ran to Whitewater. He ran first to Snow Creek. There's an old village site there, Native American archaeology. He ran into Whitewater, snuck up through the Morongo Valley, went to the oasis at Morongo Valley, Morongo Oasis there, went way out back to 29 Palms, the village site, so he knew where he was going. How did Willie survive all this time? Well, he knew the area extensively because he had traveled all the trails. This was ancient tribal knowledge, and he knew where the water was. So maybe to a lot of people look at how could you run across the desert?
He was on foot, right?
He was on foot. They were both on foot, Carlota and Willie. And they ran to 29 Palms. Legend has it, I'm sorry, we were here near Pikes Canyon, and the posse came upon Carlota's body. And at the time, they instantly reported, oh, Willie killed her, he's a heathen, he even killed the girl, he left her to die out there. And there's a little twist to that story, I'll do that in a few minutes. Willie continued to run, went to 29 Palms. Apparently his grandmother was there and tried to get him to surrender, and he just kind of beat her up a little, and she threw his gun into the pond. So that's another legend. Did the current owners of the 29 Palms Inn ever find a gun in the pond? And there's some people say yes they did, some say no, that was just a made up story. Willie continued to run through the Bullion Mountains, way out past what is now the 29 Palms Marine Base. On foot, and the posse would come across like, oh, we found the remains of a lizard that he ate. So this guy really knew what he was doing out in the desert. He was a survivor in the old Paiute way. Continued out here, went back here, he kind of looped around, and ended up in Ruby Mountain over a 2-week period, where he barricaded himself high up in the rocks, and he didn't kill any of the posse. He was an expert marksman. He wounded one of them, like shot him in the hip, caught him on his belt buckle, and shot a couple of the horses, so he crippled the posse. And as I said, the part of the story that's not too publicized is that Clara True, the Indian agent at the time, a woman organized a party to go out and rescue them.
How many members were there in the posse?
I don't know exactly. That's
Like
a very good
less
question.
than
A lot. A lot. I mean, there were way more than Willie.
Because in the movie, there's a lot.
Yeah, in the movie, it's like everybody and their brother. So, yeah, Willie was one smart and totally in shape. If he was a spirit runner, he was used to running great distances, as the river tribes all have been traditionally. The Mojave, the Kachan, the Yuman, the even some of the Southern Paiute. They would run up and down the river. They had manhood rituals where they had to run all the way from the Colorado River to the ocean and back in 3 days, 300 miles, and bring back a shell to prove it. So this guy was like arguably in incredible shape and was just able to deal with being out in that hot desert on foot. So Clara True, the Indian agent of the time, who's also in the Redford film, but I don't think she had an affair with.
Oh, that's her? Yeah.
Yeah. The movie Willie is a lot fabrication, but she went out to rescue the wounded posse, brought him back. Took him 2 weeks to get back out there. And that's when they said, oh, we found him, and here's a picture of all of us standing around the body. But if you see the picture, you can't even see who it is on the ground. It looks like a large man. You can just barely see part of a body. And Willie was, 150 pounds, 5'8". And then they said they burned the body. So people were wondering, why didn't you bring the body back? Because that's something that would typically be done in those years. We want to see that murdering, heathen. So that was the official story for many years. And until in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, anything you would read about it, Desert Magazine, the old Desert Magazine, some of you may be familiar with are you familiar with that? The classic old Desert Magazine out of Palm Desert. They would often publish stories. Oh, here's an interview with one of the posse members, Ben de Crevecoeur, 30 years later. And, every story for decades reaffirmed that telling of the story. This is just another one of the flyers that was posted widely and even publicized in the New York Times during this. So because President Taft campaigning in Riverside, and all the national press was there, all these rumors of maybe there was going to be an Indian uprising and they were trying to assassinate the president. So this one family incident just blew up into anything, Oh, he's going to go out in the desert and organize a band of murderers, and we're going to, anything could happen. So the murderous Indian, the story became part of fueling the fires of some of the miscommunications and misunderstanding between Native and Anglo people of the era, very sadly, especially. This is a little picture of the Gilman Ranch in Banning, the way it looks today, just so you get an idea of the landscape of the time. So when we talk about some of the literatures and how they have evolved, the telling of the story through time. This is Whitewater, one of the other places where Willie had run through.
That's on the way to Palm Springs, correct?
Yeah, at the
Right
base
over.
of the San Gorgonio Mountains on the Palm Springs. As you come in, and Snow Creek, which is, as you go into Palm Springs, is a really beautiful area up against the mountains, Mount San Jacinto, and there's also water in there. And a lot of really neat Native American archaeology up in there. So these are just some of the places involved in this story. The Mission Inn in downtown Riverside, I'm sure you all are familiar with that. That's where Taft was campaigning for president when this unfortunate story happened. And this is typical of Mojave Desert terrain. Very rugged, rough, and remote, especially back then. Running through the wonderland of rocks, through parts of what is now Joshua Tree National Park. And here is a picture of one of the posse members. So,
Didn't the same sheriff
pretty rugged times.
continue on through the whole chase?
De Crevecoeur. I think one of them did, yeah. So I don't have that name offhand. Yeah, some of them weren't wounded. There are a few, especially some of the native trappers who we don't know most of their names because they were considered they didn't have the right to vote, so they weren't really citizens. They were just there to help the posse guys. So, and here's a picture of Clara True, the Indian agent. So you can see that she doesn't look like Catherine Ross from the film. She wasn't like
No, it's Susan George or
hot
whatever.
20-something had a hot affair with Robert Redford. Ben de Crevecoeur, one of the posse members. And here is the disputed picture of the posse with the body of Willie. So here's somebody laying on the ground. But if you come up and look close, and it's also in that book I'm handing out, the handouts I'm giving you, it's really hard to tell who that is for real. So some people said this looks a little suspicious. And forensic evidence, when the story was revisited in 2007, Palm Springs Life had a big article about it by the journalist Ann Jappinga, who's a friend of mine also. She talked to a forensic anthropologist who said, look, if a body was out in the desert, that desert air in the autumn, like this time of year is still hot in the desert and dry, a body would not look like that after 2 weeks. The body would be really dried out, and there's a very good chance the body wouldn't even be intact because of coyotes. So when we look at this story through a more contemporary lens, we're able to see from our perspective some of the holes in the story. So the idea that he killed himself and the body laid there and looked fresh for 2 weeks has been highly disputed for many people. So October 1st, 1909 was the first published piece about this incident, written by the New York Times. There were rumors that said Willie was drunk the night he killed Mike Boniface. There were rumors that said it was an uprising of Indians that were going to kill the president. There were even rumors that he raped Carlota and forced her to run off with him at gunpoint. October 17th, 1909, we see, a little over 2 weeks later, the New York Times reports the title, Indian Outlaw Killed Himself. Willie Boy, the Paiute Indian desperado for whom 3 armed posses have been searching the San Bernardino Mountains, was found dead yesterday where he had been making his final stand. And since then, that was the beginning of all these other things written. Date unknown, probably the 1930s, in the Indio Daily News. A local poet and legend of the Coachella Valley, named Paul Wilhelm, wrote a story called Desert Lore, the True Facts Behind the Famed Willie Boy Affair. Wilhelm claims to have known Mike Boniface personally, and he recounts the widespread and now proven to be false rumor that Carlota had etched pictographs into the sand at one point at a water hole, which said, some Indian people supposedly interpreted saying, I'm dying, come rescue me. And Native American people have looked at the drawings in the sand like, what is that? That's not language, that's just maple leaf scribbles. So some of the myths about the untrue rumors and myths were continued to be passed down for some years. In the 1930s, classic desert author and Indio pioneer Nina Paul Shumway, is anybody familiar with her work? Highly recommend her work. She was from a pioneering Indio date farm family starting in the 1920s and a really good writer who was published nationally in magazines. And she wrote a book in 1960 called Your Desert and Mine, which is considered a staple desert classic book. So if you're interested in the history of the Coachella Valley and the rising of the date farms and all the farming, that's a really neat book to read. So she wrote some short stories in which she recounted the Willie story. And her telling was pretty much the same as the earlier ones. In 1941, Old Desert Magazine, quickly, here is the official marker the historical marker at Willie's death site on Ruby Mountain. And I'm not sure if there is still a marker there because I know that there has been one that was destroyed and vandalized. And then people had to put a fence around it. You know how people are these days. They still go out and destroy things. Like you were saying, you know, anything is fair game now for whoever to steal something or destroy it. So there has been in San Bernardino County, this is San Bernardino County, right? So it is a local county historical site. There's a marker there if anybody's interested. But I cannot guarantee that the marker is there because it has been vandalized. Yeah.
Those 12 posses split that $50?
Yeah, right. That's who got the money, right? We don't even know that. That's a really good question, and I need to investigate that. That's a very good question. And declare a true get any of that money. The Indian agent who rescued all the guys that were disabled. She must have been a tough lady living in that era and having to
So what's an
rescue a
Indian
posse.
agent? What's an Indian agent?
Oh, well, at the time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had started many years before as a federal agency designed to work with Native American people and sort of change them and get them to adapt and come into reservations. And so the people in charge of each of these like outposts would be the local Indian
Was
agent.
Morongo established already?
Morongo was established, and that's where Clara True was. So she worked for the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal agency. The story of Sitting Bull's assassination, is anybody familiar with that? That's been rendered in a lot of films. The Dakota, Standing Rock, the Sitting Bull, not wanting to come into the reservation, and
He came in with Buffalo Bill first, though.
yeah, because he got to go make money on the circus.
Yeah, but then
That's a really interesting-
they started ghost dancing, and he was murdered.
Yeah, and so a lot of the Standing Rock people were practicing the ghost dance because they were just despondent, because you're damned if you do and damned if you didn't. And what's very interesting too to me personally is my daughter is the there's 4 greats, I think. 4 great-grandfathers was the Indian agent at Fort Yates, James McLaughlin. That's my daughter's ancestor. So she's got some really interesting, that has also piqued my interest in these stories. Wow, this is like extended family, true history that I'm connected to, and it's quite fascinating. So James McLaughlin, it's been rendered in a lot of films about that era. I just watched a new film that was just made about that whole episode and incident. And there's James McLaughlin, the character, and I have to call my daughter, hey, your grandpa's on there. And I watched this movie, and she's like, okay. He was the Indian agent at Fort Yates, South Dakota. And his job was to get the Indians to comply. The federal government was saying, hey, they gotta come in off the res. Or they gotta come in out the wilds, we gotta civilize and tame them, because if we don't, look what happened to Custer, So that was the role of the Indian agent, to be an intermediary between Indian people and the white world, and the federal government. Does that make sense? Okay, so that was Clara True's job. So here you get an example of those so-called smoke signals in the ground that Carlota wrote. And this was published in the Desert magazine in the 1941, written by James Carling. And it's an interview with 2 of the trackers, Ben de Crevecoeur and Joe Tutane. So what's interesting about all these tellings is that no Native American trackers were interviewed for any articles. So that's also reflective of the era. Their point of view wasn't even considered important. It was just, the sheriffs were important, and the men. So in 1960, the story took new dimensions with Harry Lawton's book, which is a famous classic, Willie Boy, A Desert Manhunt, which he wrote in a gripping Western. If you like Western novels, like Louis L'Amour, those kind of books, this book reads just like that. And he published it with the Malky Museum Press in Banning, and had the approval of the Morongo tribe of Cahuilla Indians at the time. So this was considered the gold standard of the real story for many years. In 1971, guess what happened? 1970, Robert Redford and Robert Blake co-starred in a major film version of the events in Tell Them Willie Boy Is Here.
If you want your OJ comparison, use Robert Blake, because it's got a nice irony to it.
Yeah, Robert Blake, who later went on to...
Went out to be a real murderer and play in Cold
I know,
Blood.
it's chilling to watch that movie.
So he's a murdering all around.
Yeah, it was prescient, foretelling. How many of you have seen the movie, the Robert Redford movie? Okay, it's kind of rare.
I can make copies if anybody wants.
Well, that's super cool. I have a copy of the DVD, or the VHS tape,
Yeah.
but I cannot find it on streaming anywhere. But there is a bootleg version on YouTube. There was last time I looked. Very interesting book, some film, especially with Robert Redford in it. So Carlota, unfortunately, was played by a white woman who didn't look very good. It was a pretend Indian. It didn't look very well. But what's interesting also, they used some of the local Indian people. Catherine Sebo Sawville, the great Cahuilla elder, an historian and leader who passed away a few years ago. She's actually in the film. So, and they recreated the traditional.
Is she Ernie's
village
sister?
site.
Or?
Yep, she is. I know Ernest.
She's Cahuilla or Serrano?
She was,
He's Serrano.
no, he's both. He's Cahuilla and Serrano. So, what's interesting is I never heard her or saw her represent herself as Serrano. And that could be because she was born on the Los Coyotes Reservation. So she identified as Cahuilla. But Ernest,
She spoke language there, right?
yeah, she spoke Cahuilla. And Ernest has identified as Serrano Cahuilla. And he speaks both languages.
We have the Kuma up here to give a talk about that.
I'll have to ask Ernest about that in a way that may not be too offensive. Like,
Well, he's trying,
so what's up with Catherine?
the language
That would be
program
great.
they're doing
Yeah,
is like Serrano language, you know?
yeah. They also are starting to offer some Cahuilla languages too.
It's almost identical.
Yeah, they're very closely related, which makes sense because the two tribes interlapped and lived in overlapping regions. Still do, actually, still do. Okay, so the Robert Redford movie. Robert Redford is a big hero, and one of the big things that was not accurate was that they had, towards the end of the film, it was man on man, Robert Redford versus William Blake, hunting, you know, trying to get to each other in the rocks, and that's not what happened in real life. We had the posse getting held off by Willie, who was up in the rocks. So it was actually the Indian guy that was out shooting the posse. So how do you think the Robert Redford film ends? If it's down to the last 20 minutes and we got Robert Redford and Willie Boy scrambling through the rocks in the desert, who's gonna win? Of course, Robert Redford. He's the big hero, right, of the day. So,
You lost in Bolivia.
interesting.
You lost in Bolivia.
He lost in Bolivia.
Butch Cassidy.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, he got his comeuppance. Not long after. Very good. Yeah, he got his, didn't he? So, what's interesting is that the film reinforces the Eurocentric, the European, the white people's version of the story, which was completely dominant at the time. A Native American person didn't have a voice. And so the story starts to leak and change some years later, in the 1990s. So for decades, this is the totally accepted, here's the cover of my DVD. So this was a great film, as a Western, it's got all the right elements. Unrequited love, we're back to Romeo and Juliet, the young star-crossed lovers, they both end up dead, supposedly. You've got the sheriff, the horses. This is a real classic film, and if you have a chance to watch it, it's a really good movie to watch.
It's on the Western Channel on TV.
Is it?
Yeah, every
Okay,
month or
so you
so.
can watch it, and there's another one. Robert Redford is bigger, of course, and he wins, but there's Willie making his last stand, the proud Indian fighting to the end. Then in the early 1990s, something started shifting. And it started shifting because two historians from Redlands, James Sandos and Larry Burgess, did some interviews with some Chemehuevi Indian people across the desert, some of them related to Willie and Carlota, and started asking them, what's your version of this story? And they co-authored a book called The Hunt for Willie Boy, Indian Hating and Popular Culture, published in 1994. In this book, they contest some of the so-called facts of the earlier tellings and publications and films, and they even went so far as to call the earlier tellings of the story racist and Indian hating. They then reconstructed the story from a different perspective by telling the story using a Chemehuevi pattern of storytelling. So throughout their reconstruction of the events, they have Native American people telling stories about what happened. It's very interesting the way they did this. So this book threw a wrench into the whole thing and started making people rethink it and say, maybe there's more to this story. For example, maybe Willie didn't kill himself at the Ruby Mountain. And so things started bubbling up with this story, like, maybe not all is what it seems. Oh, this is just a little thing. In the 100-year anniversary, a playwright and Fox Productions put on a theater production up in Joshua Tree at the High Desert Playhouse. Did anybody get up to see that? I did. I liked it, but then Cliff Trafser, my historian, scholar friend that I'm working with, he's like, oh my God, no, they got a bunch of stuff wrong. I tried to tell them, and they ignored me, so he kind of disgruntled with how this turned out. But it was well attended, and it was sort of a commemoration to what happened. So this was in 1909, 100 years later. And as we reached the 100-year mark in 1909, more and more things started bubbling up. Before I talk about this book, which is very significant, something very significant was published about the Willie story that really just blew my mind. It was like, I got the Malky Museum newsletter, and I'm just like sitting there reading, drinking some coffee. Oh yeah, I'm like, what? Catherine Sebel wrote a short piece, and she said, it's time to tell the truth about what happened with Willie and Carla. 100 years have passed. My father knew some of the trackers, and they were sworn on penalty of death not to say anything. Willie was not captured, he got away. But those sheriffs had to save face, and I'm telling you this now because this truth has to come out. It's been 100 years. And I was just like, whoa, time stopped for me. I was like, that's, for someone of her stature, I mean, she's been honored by the Smithsonian. She was and remains seriously an amazing person who led the fight, the struggle and success to keep Cahuilla culture alive and to keep the Cahuilla language alive. It almost went extinct. And primarily through working with, at the start, Lowell Bean, the famous and amazing anthropologist, who in the early 60s, or the late 60s, was a UCLA graduate student in anthropology. And one of his professors said, why don't you go out to the desert and see if you can find any of those Cahuilla Indians? I don't think there's very many left, and their language is extinct though. And Lowell Bean went out there as a student, and he's like, oh my God, I'm meeting all these people that speak Cahuilla. So even in the 60s, it was believed that the Cahuilla people had just kind of disappeared. And Catherine Sebel led that to change, to the point where now we all know the Cahuilla people have a very strong presence in the Coachella Valley and beyond. So Catherine is arguably one of the most important people in that renaissance and survival. So she's come out and saying, hey, I heard a different version of the story. I really take that seriously. And so since then, there's been more buzz. So if you get a Native American perspective on this, and I'm not saying, for 100% I can verify this, but Native people in the desert region, many of them descendants of Willie, and I know some of them personally, they say that he got away. But they could not come out with that because what would happen? He killed the people who helped him, tribal members that helped him get away, or helped him when he supposedly went up to Pahrump, which is another band of Paiute Indians in Pahrump, Nevada, that they helped him. They didn't want to help him at first, but then one of the leaders said, hey, he's a sick young man, he's asking for our help. And in the Native traditional way, if we don't help him, we're all going to be messed up. We have to help him heal from his sickness because he killed somebody. We have to help him or it's going to make us all get sick. So that's a traditional Native thing. You're only as strong as your weakest link.
Pahrump was the most sacred village to the desert Paiutes.
Is it?
Yeah, the Nuvaguns, the people of Mount Charleston. It's right at the base of Mount Charleston.
Yeah.
And the Chemehuevi were a late migration in the historical period
Yeah.
to, 29 Palms, first Chemehuevi Valley, probably from, according to Carabel, the Providence Mountains area by Baker. But he would have gone up there under the protection of Chief Tacopa.
Yeah, and for protection and also healing.
Yeah, and it was you would have to clear it with Chief Tacopa in order to take refuge.
Sadly, I have a friend who just passed away this last spring, George Ross. He was half Pahrump Paiute. And he had done a lot of oral histories with an historian in the region. And I had always wanted to ask him certain things, and I just felt like, I don't want him to think I'm his friend just because I'm trying to pick his brain. But that was a question I wanted to ask him. What do you know about Willie? And my guess would be, even if he did, he'd be like, I don't know anything. Because, he grew up in a time when you couldn't speak up about things. But I really wish I had had the opportunity to ask him. He also had known some of the Manson family members, because some of Charlie's people, they actually went into the town of Shoshone near Pahrump, because they got away from the Manson family. And some of them actually lived there until they died. And my friend George knew them. And I was saying, what about this guy? Because I read about him. He's like, wait a minute, how do you know those people? And I'm like, whoa, I don't know him. I just read. And then I kind of didn't want to bug him anymore about it. Yeah. And then there's also stories that once in a while Willie's mother would disappear out into the desert with a wagon load of supplies. Come back. So there's stories about, hey, his mom was helping sneak in food. And of course, in those days, it probably would have been pretty easy for Willie just to go hide out way out in the desert because there were hardly any people. Clifford Trapser's book, The Chumwebby Song, is considered a landmark. This was published in 2015, and this is my co-author on this historical book about Willie Boy. So he gives a complete history of the Chumwebby people. He spent a number of years going out and getting interviews with Native people, and he has a whole chapter in his book dedicated to rendering their telling of the Willie episode.
Is that on Amazon? Can I get it?
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. And one thing that Cliff has told me that I find really profound is that the Willie incident wasn't just some exciting Western manhunt to the Chumwebby people, especially the 29 Palms, who are now the 29 Band Palms of Mission Indians. He says that event was a watershed event, a watermark event in their lives because nothing was ever the same again for them. It gave the U.S. government, the BIA, the opportunity to go in and say, okay, you guys have to come in off the desert and we're going to put you on a reservation. Because of this incident, that gives us the right to do that because you're related to this crazy Indian. So that small band of people were forcibly moved from their ancestral home at 29 Palms and relocated down in the Coachella Valley, which at the time was just like nothing, a wasteland in the middle of nowhere. And they had to figure out a way to survive and organize themselves. And to this day, they're just a very small tribe of maybe a couple dozen members. But I find it pretty stunning that they've come from that 100 years ago. Now they own a huge casino, and they're founding an Indian college. They're great people. The more I get to know them, like, these people are amazing. Like, look what they've been through. And yet they're taking a lot of their casino money and they're starting a community college for Native American students. So I see them like trying to make life better for people and not just, you know.
Put it in their pockets.
Yeah. And they're also doing a lot of water monitoring. They're helping to try to monitor the water quality for the Coachella Valley. So it was a watershed, a turning point, because they had to move from their home and they were told where to go. And that little plot of land they get is really horrible. It's like in the middle of the desert where it's 125 degrees all summer. And, you know, the fact they were able to survive that, and not to mention, you know, probably being afraid for their lives. Like, you guys are related to that guy that murdered the, you know, they probably had a lot of death threats and so forth. So this book is quite a read, and I know you're telling me about, you're really interested in the Chumwebby, so you might want to really read this. So anyway, this is a story that just continues to evolve. I keep hearing, oh, somebody wrote an article, you know, comparing the telling of Willie Boy in Harry Lawton's book to Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and I'm just going, no. Who the hell are you? Are you a scholar? I mean, you're just making stuff up. So, you know, I'm seeing stuff on the internet, people have blogs, hey, the story of Willie Boy. It's like one of these free-for-all stories, but that's also what makes it a living story, is that it's kind of like Wikipedia, and I just thought of that, where anybody can just keep going in and adding stuff or changing stuff. And it's kind of interesting to just know what is really the truth in the end, who's the authority on something. And in this case, there may not be an ultimate authority. It's just a lot of people and a lot of little pieces of evidence and always that constant intrigue and that little element of tragedy and heart sickness over how tragic that some young people had to die, especially the girl. Oh yeah, that's the other thing. Forensic evidence and revisiting a lot of details about Carlota's getting shot have shown a lot of strong evidence that one of the posse members shot her, killed her on accident. She was wearing Willie's coat at the time, so the idea was that Willie had gone off to get some food and he left her in the canyon where the trackers saw her from a distance and thought it was Willie, because she was shot like from the back and from a far distance. So there was some evidence, and Anja Panga's story, A Legend Undone, in 2008 in the Palm Springs Life magazine, she goes really into that, gives a lot of evidence about supporting the idea that the posse accidentally killed her, and they cover that up because, of course, they couldn't, you know, cop to do it.
Or deliberately. Or deliberately killed her.
The posse, yeah.
I mean, he says they were
But she
trying to
was
rescue
shot and
her.
killed by, not by Willie, but by, and then finally, Catherine Siva Seville also, in her autobiography, which is pretty amazing, it's huge, it's like 2 books that are this big, and it's written in a storytelling pattern with a Korea linguistic scholar, and it's told in Korea and English. And she actually has a couple little pieces about the Willie story in there. And she repeatedly keeps saying, they never caught him. Here's what my father told me. The white people told the Indians, don't tell anyone he got away from us, otherwise there'll be trouble for you. So Catherine Siva Seville has published this in different publications, including her own memoir.
Ruth?
So, yeah,
The girl, what's her name again?
Carlota.
Carlota. Is she buried in a cemetery?
She is, actually.
Local cemetery?
She's buried on the Morongo Reservation. And a couple years ago, one of my students at College of the Desert knew that I was interested in the story. And one day he walked in and put some picture on my desk. He's like, here's a picture of Carlota's grave. I'm like, whoa. So she is buried on at the Morongo Cemetery. Graffiti at Ruby Mountain. So it's kind of interesting, but it's also pretty disrespectful. This is an historical site. Is it okay to go out and deface it? But at least they didn't write like bad words. Hunt and Willie Boy, but it's also a little creepy, I don't know. It's cool and creepy. And there's a copy of my book. And art, a retelling of the story through the voice of Carlota by the Korea artist Louis DeSoto. So if you ever go up to the visitor center at Joshua Tree National Park, 29 Palms, part of it just burned down sadly because there was some arsonists. These are still there, and he told me, because I interviewed him, he's going to publish this as a young adult novel with drawings. So it's really neat to see the story through Carlota's point of view. We've never seen that before. And this is Chemwebby Bird Singer and my friend Matt Lavis from the Lake Havasu Chemwebby Reservation doing a bird song ceremony at the Oasis, which is very profound because for almost 100 years, remember the Paiutes were taken off there, they were forced out by the government after the Willie incident. At gunpoint, you guys gotta leave. You have to come down and be on your little reservation. Because we don't know when the next one of you is gonna do an uprising and start killing people. So to have a bird singing at that was really profound. And he's not gonna go to jail or get killed for doing this. And there have since been several larger ceremonies. And this was a dedication of Cliff Trausser's book at UC Riverside Palm Desert a couple years ago, in which we see some of the surviving members of descendants of Willie Carlota. So that was a really profound. Here's one of his descendants. I'm sorry, I messed up. Previous. What happened? Okay, the young lady with the tattoos, she's part Lummi Indian, but she's one of the descendants of Carlota. So I said, can I get a picture of your tats? And she said, sure. And then finally, the last picture was the modern day incarnation of the tribe running the 29 Palms Casino. That was about like 29. So the story's not over. Every time I turn around, there's something new coming at me. And the tribal members had informed me recently that they were approached by somebody else that wants to make another movie about it. Another Hollywood production. So we'll see if that comes to pass. Are there any questions? I know, hopefully I haven't gone on too long. Gary?
So going back to the picture of the posse and the supposed body, you said that there was an opinion that if he had died 2 weeks ago, the body wouldn't look like that.
Yeah.
But how do they know that he died when 2 weeks ago?
They don't know. They don't.
So that point to me is,
It's kind of fuzzy because the picture is from far away, you can't tell who it is, and the body doesn't look all deep, what you do see of it doesn't look
but if
decomposed.
he was wounded or who knows what, or.
No, they said he killed, supposedly he took the shotgun and then you see a head and you're like, if he killed himself, there probably would have been.
But what I'm saying is, how do they know when he did that act? If they're dating.
Oh, I see
2
what you're
weeks
saying. It
before
could have been a
picture.
minute before they got there.
Right.
I
so
hear you.
that
But
seems
then
a
the other
little
thing would be,
sketchy.
why would he stay there for 2 weeks?
But if
if
he
he
was
knew he was gonna
wounded
get
or
punished.
tired and gave
He
up
wasn't
or
wounded.
something.
No, they just said he was fine, because he held the posse off, and they had to go back and replenish. So that's a very good point. But most of the contention was that based on forensic scientists looking at that picture they presented, was that the body looked really fresh. So that is a really good point, though. Maybe he heard him coming, oh, it's over, but then why would he sit there at the same spot for 2 weeks? He'd be really stupid, knowing he was gonna probably know they were gonna come back. So,
Any other questions of Ruth? Okay, let's give her a big hand. Thank you very much.